All right, good afternoon. I have 10 minutes after 4 o'clock or 16:10, so we're a little bit behind here. But the next talk coming up is exploring the myths and realities of academic research on hackers. And to present this, we have Thomas J. Holt, Ph.D., who is an assistant professor within the Department of Criminal Justice for the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So let's get a big boo for Thomas Holt. Big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I realize that's quite a dry-sounding title. Sort of, oh boy, what the hell can this be about? Well, hopefully in the course of the next, 40 minutes, something like that, I can give you some idea of what it means to actually do research, how you do it well, and what is actually involved. It's not just some scientist who's trying to figure out how can I put hackers into a bad light, or how exactly can I put an appropriate spin onto something. Instead, good science, good social science that is like anything else. You want to do a balanced, fair presentation. And tell you a little bit about myself, I've been researching hackers for about the past 3 years. I've gone to conventions, I've been going to 2600 meetings, been talking to hackers, been trying to understand the phenomenon at very basic levels. What does it mean to be a hacker? Why do you do this in the first place? And it's something that in criminal justice, in sociology, psychology, only a handful of people are doing. And there are some complaints, there are some people who say that we're not doing a good job of it. Primarily, I think it's due in part to some of the complications that are already present. There's a lot of people who say, even within the hacker community, that the media doesn't do a good job of presenting hackers and hacking. There's a bias there for whatever reason. People, if you go to DEF CON, will be giving talks about how to talk to the media. What's the appropriate thing to say? Don't tell them about the exploits that you're involved in. And even if you don't tell them anything negative, they may put it into a specific spin that fits their mold of the news. If it bleeds, it leads. That's the idea. So in that way, talking to the media can put hacking into a negative spin, even if you think it's very positive behavior, something that has benefits. And it kind of spills over into academic research. Probably professors may be just up to the same old tricks as the media. In fact, this is kind of furthered by a study that was done a couple of years ago at DEF CON by two researchers, Shell and Dodge. They conducted a study at DEF CON 8 trying to assess some of the psychological components of hacking. And several people, particularly if you Google these two researchers, you may come upon some sites by individuals who were present talking about the quality of the research, asking not only why were they doing this, but why were they doing such a poor job of it. This does not seem like sound science. And to some extent they're right, but there are also some reasons as to why perhaps there were some issues at the outset, or why people thought they weren't doing a good job. First and foremost, there are people who've complained they had no definition for hacker, going to a convention and saying, well, we just assume you're all hackers. That's not really the right idea. And clearly you might catch a few hackers, but thinking that every single person in attendance will be is just false. Also, they've done something that was very, very questionable. They've given individuals who participated in the study the potential to get data back. So they put at the bottom of their survey, which was a psychological battery, ways to get information about the individual. So if you want to know what's your psychological makeup look like, give us your email address and your phone number and we'll mail you back the results. That kind of potential is very, very bad. You don't necessarily want to go back to your participants. You may not want to do that kind of research. So it introduces some potential for negative results. And also, some asked about the applicability of the questions that they were using. Why do you need to know about the sexual habits of computer hackers? What is the benefit there? They asked a myriad of questions relating to how often do you sleep, how often do you have sex, what kind of sexual partners do you have, things that at the outset you may say, why do you need to know that? What is that going to tell you about computer hacking? So something like this kind of research may put a bad taste into people's mouths and may automatically introduce the potential for bias. That's not what all social scientists are trying to do, though. We don't necessarily want to know about how you've hacked NASA or if you've had some kind of major, huge ownage on a box. That may not be what we want to know. We will ask questions like, have you ever participated in an illegal act? Have you ever engaged in a hack that had a malicious consequence? That's not to put you into some kind of mold. Rather, it may just be, we are curious to know, what kinds of hacks do you participate in? What do you define as a hack? What is your actual definition for it? Because we don't necessarily know. Such a broad range of activities. People may have different definitions or terms for it. So we are simply trying to understand behavior. And in the course of doing so, we have to implement good strategies to collect data and to protect the data of individuals who participate. If you're providing sensitive information to someone, you'll want to know, how is it that you're maintaining this? Are you just leaving it on some computer somewhere? How exactly are you going about protecting the identities of your participants? So ideally, what you'll learn in the course of the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes is how we actually do this. And it's important for individuals like myself, sociologists, criminologists, to come to individuals who are interested in hacking, who may define themselves as a hacker, or even be involved in information security and use principles of hacking or hacking techniques to pen test or to build sound systems. Because they are such related behaviors, it's important for us. There's a lot we don't know about computer hacking. Some of our data is very old, some of the results are dated, and as a consequence, we have a need to understand a lot of different issues. Like, what do hackers, what do individuals in computer security even, define as ethical and unethical computer use? Everybody probably has a fair use policy at their job. Maybe you even helped craft that language. Or you're dealing with end users who constantly violate that fair use policy and say, well, I didn't even know it was there. I don't know what that means. I'm not supposed to look at YouTube all day. So there are some potential issues there. And also, what kinds of gender issues are present? What kind of racial differences are present? A lot of this research was conducted in the 80s and in the mid-90s, and then there's some recent stuff as well. But thinking about the way that technology's evolved over time, it's possible that there are demographic shifts that we're going to see. It's not necessarily just going to be the white male in their teens or 20s who are from middle-class backgrounds. Things can change. And in terms of why you would even want to participate, what's the value if you consider yourself to be a computer hacker? To say, okay, fine, I'll get involved. I'll help you with your research. There's a number of different and very positive things that can result. First and foremost, you are the ones who can tell us about the behavior. We can make wild suppositions about what actually happens or make sort of stereotypical base suggestions, like every single hacker is a white male, which is clearly not necessarily the case. We need you all to tell us what happens. Also, I realize, yes, there are all white males in the room, but I know there's some people here who are not. There's also at least 1, 2, 3 women in the room, so that's a plus. Clearly it's not all male. So, we need you guys to tell us, you guys and gals, to tell us what it's all about. Also, your involvement can help inform many, many different fields. Not only policy making, when if for some reason a law enforcement agency comes to us, a state agency, and says, what's going on? How do we understand this behavior? Or what do we need to worry about? We can help give guidance. You all can help us understand the phenomenon of hacking to get past that stereotypical point of view of hacker equals bad. Most end users, when they hear that term, think, uh-oh, what's going to happen to my system? They don't actually get the full premise. If we can do sound research that gets out into the public domain, we may be able to change some of those perspectives. But it hinges upon your involvement. During this, you can learn a little bit about how social scientists actually do sound research. If you come from a computer science background or software and information systems, you probably have never had to sit through a social science research course. So this may be relatively new, may be exciting to you. And it just furthers the course of science generally, which is a very, very positive thing. Now, overall, there's a couple of different methods that social scientists use to actually collect data. If you come up with a research question, if you can get a hold of a population of individuals, you have to know what is it that you're going to ask. How do you actually go about doing it? There are qualitative and quantitative research methods that can be employed. And quantitative methods are simply like surveys. You have very pointed research questions with predetermined answers. If you've ever done a phone survey for some company or filled out some kind of product survey, you've done one of these things before. And the data itself is often numbers-based, so there are values assigned to each specific answer. And then there's qualitative research, where you ask very broad, open-ended questions. Typically, you're focusing on a very narrow size of a population, maybe 10, 20, 100 people. And in doing so, you maybe interview them. You ask very open-ended questions to get an understanding of what it means to them. So you don't have an already set answer. And it makes for much more interesting results. Depending on what kind of training you've had, you might do qualitative, you might do quantitative, you may be able to do both. Each has merit, and it just depends on what kind of research you're more interested in. And in order to actually collect information, we need data. We need to go to some source to get our information. You can have official statistics, you can have self-report data, and then you can generate materials from other places. Each type of data has its own value system as well. Start with official statistics. Here we're talking about information from any number of different groups. From the criminal justice perspective or criminology, we spend a lot of time getting information from police, from law enforcement agencies, statistics on the number of break-ins that occur, robbery, murder, etc. We can also get stuff from census data, knowing who lives where, what's the size of a region, what are the number of people who live there, and voter information in some cases, if you're in political science or sociology. Thinking about computer hacking, though, as a phenomenon, social scientists can't go to official statistics that often. There are not a huge number of individuals who are arrested for computer hacking or for hacker-related behaviors. And the instances that occur may not necessarily be indicative of all the hacking that occurs out there, the stuff that is not even necessarily illegal, the stuff that people do on a day-to-day basis that could be construed as a hack. So official data isn't very helpful for social science research on computer hacking. Instead, we tend to rely on self-report data. And this is information we obtain by going to you, going to an individual and asking, what have you done? How often in the past 6 months have you tried to guess someone's password? How often in the past 12 months have you received a computer virus? Those are kinds of different individual behaviors or individual actions we can talk about, as well as measuring attitudes and beliefs, like it's very clear how I should engage in ethical behaviors when online. There are very clear guidelines for what is construed as acceptable behavior. Those are attitudinal or belief measures. And when we get this kind of data, we can actually use it to help predict future behavior. We can use it for a number of different purposes. And in order to collect it, we may use surveys, where we give Likert scale questions. Do you strongly agree? Do you strongly disagree with this? We can also do interviews, where we sit down and ask very pointed questions or broad-ranging ones, like, what do you define as a hacker? But there are some problems with this kind of research generally, and the same is true with official statistics. Each has its own benefit, but it's important to focus on the ones related to self-report data, because this is what we use quite often. First and foremost, it's hard to really verify what you get from the individual. Anybody can lie and say, oh yeah, I've done all of these things. I am a horrible, horrible person. And trust me, that's the way it goes. You can't necessarily go back and find out how to validate those responses, though. That person may have never had an arrest. That person may have never had any kind of interaction with the police or some agency that would document it. So that way you can say, okay, this is actually correct. We may underrepresent populations, too. If you asked an entire school full of students, how many of you have ever participated in what, however you define, a hack? The number of kids that would respond yes to that may be very, very small, so it wouldn't be worth your time to ask hundreds and hundreds of people. And even in coming up with good data, going back to the school for a second, if you're thinking about juvenile delinquency, say you go into a grade school and you're able to survey the kids who are absent, the kids who are truant, those are typically the baddest kids in the school. Those are the ones you'd really want to know about their juvenile delinquency, their illegal behaviors, the things that they engage in that are considered questionable. If they're gone on the day when you're there to administer your survey, you're losing a portion of the population. So we have some difficulty in collecting data just from the outset. And also, it's hard to really say this is a nationally representative sample. That's what we want to see when we collect data, but it's not always possible. But despite some of these problems, despite some of the issues, this is the most important thing that we have, or one of the most important tools to really get at a population. And there are some alternatives. You can do observational research, where you go out and actually see what's going on in a party, or perhaps at a 2600 meeting. Maybe you go onto a forum and you just observe public communication between people. You can also get books. You can get paper resources, text, like reading the Hacker Manifesto and various diatribes that are out there. Those are just simple pieces of data that one could use. And often, some researchers take all of those pieces at once and try to triangulate the information, try to understand a problem from multiple perspectives. You may take interview data and observational data, so asking hackers about their behavior as well as observing it in a forum. Those are good ways to get at it from multiple sides at once. In talking about research on hackers, there are a few good examples of what really constitutes strong, valid science. One of the first is Jordan and Taylor. These are two British researchers who did surveys with hackers. They also collected a number of different interviews with hackers themselves, with people who call themselves security professionals, and they sort of vaguely refer to 20 interviews with interested parties. Whatever that may be, I don't know. But at the very least, they take a multi-track approach. And in doing so, they were able to examine some of the values, some of the beliefs of hackers, what we would refer to as a subculture. It's focused on technology. They say there's a lot of prominence of secrecy, trying to keep some things quiet. They also examined the relationship between hackers and security professionals, that sort of oppositional relationship. Well, as much as we try to protect, they try to get in. So that gives us some idea about the dynamics of that situation. And recently they've branched into studying hacktivism and political ideology behind some kinds of hacking. It's interesting. They're asking questions about how are new forms of hacking falling back to the old notion of the hacker ethic. What's the value of certain kinds of hacks? Another guy by the name of Wu, he's a psychologist. He's done some research looking at the psychological components of hacking, specifically how individuals perform a hack and what that does with their overall behavior. He put this up on hackerslab.com, had a number of people participate, 729 people. It's a big sample. A lot of it was Korean, in fact, because he had this translated into a couple of different languages. So it's interesting data, and it tells us that there are some connections between aggressive kinds of hacks and a psychological makeup of narcissism. People who are very ego-driven or very dominant, they tend to engage in more aggressive hacks, at least based on his data. And he also suggests that there is some value of the intrinsic motivation of the hack. People who are creative, who want to explore, are much more likely to engage in these behaviors very often. And there's some connection between the challenge-skill balance. In other words, the harder a behavior is to do, the more likely a hacker is going to enjoy the hack if they can push their skills up to meet that challenge. Something's really hard, and you can actually complete it. The hack is that much more valuable to the individual. Then finally, there's a sociologist, a gentleman by the name of Meyer. He did some work in the late 80s, and unfortunately nobody's replicated it. So we're depending on some old information. He developed a data set based on BBS posts, as well as some interviews, some very early email, phone conversations, etc. A lot of data from hackers. And he tried to map out social relationships to understand how it is that people communicate. And he suggested that hackers resemble colleagues because they share information with one another. They provide information on how to actually complete some kinds of hacks. But they keep things private in some circumstances as well. They try to limit the amount of information some individuals get, the noobs or the people who don't really know much about hacking. And that there are also limited circumstances of peer groups where you have multi-person hacker teams or groups that have an interest in the behavior. So, This is just one example of why we need to do social research. We're dependent upon a study that was done 16 years ago, despite the massive changes that have occurred in technology and the internet. So this is the kind of thing we need to look at more often. Now, in terms of actually conducting research, once you get your research question, once you get a data set together, once you have your questions and you're ready to go, when you actually perform the study, you have to be guided by some kind of ethical principles. Every discipline has its own set of behaviors or guidelines, and some of it's born out of bad research that's been done in the past, or at least questionable research. Has anybody ever heard of the tea room trade before? It's a book that was written by a gentleman by the name of Humphrey. I'm from St. Louis, and this research was actually conducted in a place called Forest Park, big public park in downtown St. Louis. And he was examining the phenomenon of gay sex in public restrooms in this park, and they were referred to as tea rooms. He went to these places and acted as what was referred to as a lookout queen. So he stood outside of the bathroom and would open it up and say, "Hey, somebody's coming," to stop the behavior. So he was trying to understand the phenomenon by getting involved as a participant observer. After people would leave, after they would have their sexual congress and start heading back towards their car, he actually started writing down license plate numbers and physical descriptions of these guys. Now, it's one thing to be in that setting and to try to understand the dynamics between people, but he was writing down information to go back and track down these people later, to ask them demographic questions. Are you married? How old are you? What kind of job do you have? In doing this, he actually caused a lot of disruption because many of these guys were married. Many of them had regular families, stuff that no one knew about. In going back, he posed as if I remember this correctly, either as a census taker or some kind of social researcher, just to sit down and ask a few questions. And he actually had a disguise and everything to try to fool these people. And much of what he collected caused huge disruption at the university. He was a Ph.D. student when he did this. His research caused fistfights between faculty members. People left the department. Huge scandal. And this quote is from a newspaper, and someone wrote about how they were so concerned about privacy. We don't bother to think about social scientists because they are trying to pry into our lives too. So let's understand what it is that they want to do. Let's be cautious about these social researchers as well. Very questionable stuff. And thinking about his research, that pushes a lot of the importance of ethics onto all social scientists. Most every kind of social science, be it sociology, psychology, etc., has its own guiding principles about how you're supposed to collect research and what you do with the findings. First and foremost, you're never supposed to distort whatever it is that you find. If you get information that hacking is all about just learning and applying creative fixes to technology, you shouldn't then go out and write a paper about all the malicious applications of hacking, because that's not what is present in your information. Also, you're not supposed to do any kind of harm to your participants. Thinking about the tea room trade, that's a clear example of the kinds of negative repercussions research could have on those who are involved with it. And you're also supposed to maintain the confidentiality, the anonymity, and the privacy of those who engage in your overall work. And let me just go to my slide real quick so I can define each of those things exactly. Because anonymity and privacy and confidentiality have different meanings for the social science researcher. Anonymity refers to keeping someone's identity a secret. And even after data collection, you're not supposed to turn over your records. Any kind of linking information should not be available to say that, oh yeah, Joe Smith filled out survey number 452. And confidentiality refers to maintaining the information from access to anyone else, keeping all of it safe. So, why does this even matter? Why should social scientists go along with this kind of thing? Because we are legally obligated to, thanks to the National Research Act of 1974. Here they established rules and guidelines for ethical data collection and social science research. And it established boundaries for all kinds of institutions, be it hospitals, universities, and even think tanks. There are guidelines. And they created what are called institutional review boards. Institutional review boards are places where researchers have to vet all of their proposed research projects. The Institutional Review Board guarantees that you are going to use ethical principles in the course of your research. They're maintained by different offices at different places. They may be referred to by different names. Overall, though, IRBs are going to be present everywhere. They maintain research oversight. They can tell researchers what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And they are there to make sure that research subjects' welfare are protected. In order to do that, say I come up with a study. I have to send it to the Institutional Review Board. They go through it with a very fine-tooth comb. I have to tell them exactly how I'm going to conduct the study, what I do with the data, how I actually store the data, be it paper copy or computer copy. Is it going to be behind some sort of locked door? Will it be password protected? Will it be, in some cases, on a computer that never touches the internet? What are you going to do with it? Once they review it, they sit down as a committee with multiple persons, even individuals from outside of the research arena, and suggest what changes need to be done. How can this study meet our ethical guidelines, if it does not already? They can reject your proposal outright and say, if you're not meeting our guidelines, you cannot do the research. And there are some circumstances where you don't have to go through this process. If you're collecting data that's publicly available, say there are materials online on a site that anyone can access at any time, that would not necessarily have to be reviewed. But for the sake of good ethics, you ideally would. What they can also do is receive reports from the researchers. So once you've collected all your data, they demand that you write a report to them saying, here's how it was collected, here's what happened, no harm was done to the participants. When you think about this from a medical context, you can imagine how taking certain drugs or potential surgeries or anything else could seriously impact the harm or the welfare of your participants. From the social science side, say you're doing some kind of study about anorexia or bulimia, and you're dealing with people who have had this disorder in the past. You may be concerned that your research is going to push them back into the behavior. Even the same is true with drug use or different kinds of substance problems. So you may have to report that to the IRB if you find out that someone has begun to drink, do drugs, or what have you. And they just want to make sure that everything was done in an ethical and legal perspective. They also demand that you receive informed consent. And informed consent is basically where you receive from your participants, from your potential participants, their agreement to engage in the research. They have to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what's going to happen with the information. Informed consent in some cases means the person that you ask to participate has to sign a document. In other instances, you may just say, here's the form, you can review it. Just so long as you say yes, that's all I need. Often a lot of the research I do goes without signed consent. Just simply oral verification, yes, I'm willing to participate. Here's the document if you'd like to review it. That's all that's needed. However, with kids, you have to have parental consent because kids are considered to be a protected group. They can't say, oh, sure, I'll get involved on their own because they don't have the overall knowledge to do so effectively. Now, say you have really, really huge concerns. Say you're collecting data about armed robbery and burglary from active burglars and armed robbers, people who are very concerned about their potential for arrest. Or if you're talking to active hackers, people who have maybe performed some malicious attacks and they're concerned, well, what's going to happen to me if I get involved? You can apply for something called a Certificate of Confidentiality. These are federal documents that protect all the information that you collect, and it keeps the researcher from being forced to turn over their data. There's a lot of information and news coming out right now about journalists who are being put into jail for not turning over sources. This is the kind of idea that applies to research. Say you're concerned that somebody who is involved in your study could be arrested. If you have a Certificate of Confidentiality, that cannot happen. Now, you have to apply for one of these. If you get it, then you're set. But you have to tell your subjects in advance I will turn over your information if some of the following conditions apply. Say somebody says, I'm going to go home and I'm going to kill my wife tonight. Or, yeah, I've been beating my kids. Or I've been sexually molesting them. Or I'm planning on hacking my boss's computer next week because they're going to fire me. They're outsourcing my job. That's the kind of information that if it's an actual credible threat, you do have to turn over. You're obligated to do so because you may damage someone else's life. Someone else may go through physical harm as a result. So you do have to take some care about how you collect information and what you may have to turn over. Finally, let's say you think about it, a researcher comes to you and says, hey, would you participate in this study? They give you the informed consent document, seems okay, but you want to know what are they going to do with it. That was one of the things people asked Shell and Dodge at DEF CON. What are you going to do with all this research? What's the value of it? Who's going to publish something like this? In the social sciences, we have journals, we have books, and in some cases we just have more or less books for the popular public. In research journals, it's passed out to multiple researchers at different institutions who actually read your document and say, yeah, this is great, let's publish it. Or no, this doesn't quite fit our bill. These are very rigorous and require a lot of good science. There are peer-reviewed book chapters that are somewhat the same. They have slightly less high standards, but they're still a review process. And then there's just a book. If you write it, nobody's going to look at it. Doesn't matter what kind of information you present or what you've collected. Just so long as you write it and your contract goes through, you're fine. Shell and Dodge wound up writing a book from their data. I don't know if it's because of what they collected or if journals didn't want it or what have you. But a lot of people have asked, why is it just a book? What happened to your information? Also, say you participate and you want to know more about the study. The researcher can turn over general results to the population that was being studied. Think about if you conduct a sample at a university or a research project there. You can publish just a general piece of the findings. In hacker research, you could post your data or your results onto a forum or a web page or go to a con like this and present it. So you have some options to find out what actually has happened with the information you've provided. But you want to make sure that your researcher has done a couple of things. In quantitative studies, they will aggregate the information, so you can't identify a single individual. They'll just be general race and other categories. In qualitative data, you want to see some information aggregated or at least some kind of nickname used. It's not actually John Smith, it's now Joe Blow 89 or something like that. Some way to keep their actual identity out of the public. And the ethical concerns of the researcher should push the findings. Myself and a colleague were talking about doing a paper on gun violence. Unfortunately, she is such a huge gun nut that she is refusing to do it because she knows if the results went against her overall beliefs about gun use, that she wouldn't publish it. She couldn't write something negative about owning a gun or anything else. So that's fine. We won't do it because she's smart enough to know at the outset, I can't meet our ethical concerns. So, wrap it up. When should you participate in research? When the person seems reliable. When they actually tell you satisfactory answers to your question. What are you going to do with this? Why are you doing it in the first place? When they have a sound reason for doing it. And when they can actually show you some kind of informed consent and some ethical guidelines that are in play, that they can maintain anonymity over data. Now, here's the punchline of all this. I'm currently conducting 2 different research projects looking at computer hacking and hackers generally. I have a qualitative study underway and a quantitative one. In terms of the qualitative study, I'm trying to do either face-to-face or email-based interviews with individuals who consider themselves to be a hacker or have engaged in what may be defined as a hack. It takes about 90 minutes of your time. It allows you to talk about what you think about hacking. I don't care if you've never done a malicious thing in your life, but you pen test every day. If that, to you, makes you a hacker, I would like to talk to you. This gives you an opportunity to talk about what you know and why you do it. This study has also been awarded a certificate of confidentiality. So, that means that the information you provide is well protected. I'm also paying for your participation. It's just $10. I realize that's not much, but that's as little as I can actually pay out on my own. And $10 for any referral. So say you know someone who may be interested. If they complete a survey, you get $10 for every single one. Now, I'm also conducting a quantitative survey. I have an instrument that assesses a variety of different things. And I've conducted this at one other convention. I was able to get a little bit of data from it, but I'd like to do it here as well. It's a very quick survey, asks a lot of questions. The instrument itself is geared towards individuals who are interested in technology. You don't have to be a hacker to complete this. However, it does ask some questions about what could be construed as a hack and hacker. Specifically, do you view yourself as a hacker? If so, how do you define hack? I also have in there some attitudinal and some behavioral measures, so we can get a baseline. How many programming languages do you know? What do you think about ethical and non-ethical use? How do you use a computer generally? There's a few questions in there about self-control as well. From the criminal justice point of view, there's a lot of people who say that one's level of self-control is related to the kinds of behaviors you engage in. We have this notion, and it's been applied to a huge variety of behavior, but no one's applied it to computer crimes, or at least has done an excellent job in doing so. So the hope is to assess a little bit of this information. It's quick. It's completely anonymous. I ask very few demographic questions, save for age, race, and are you part-time or full-time employed. So simple questions. It takes about 15 minutes. I have small golf pencils that you can keep. Unfortunately, I cannot pay you for your participation. But if you can fill it out, if you would be interested, I would love to hear what you have to say. And I would even be happy to present it either in some forum or here next year. So I have them with me. If you would be at all interested, please come up and see me. I'd be happy to give it to you. If you have any questions generally, if you want to know what the heck is this guy doing here in the first place, here's my contact information. Be happy to give you a business card when this is over or anything else for that matter. I don't know how we're doing on time, so if there's any questions, feel free. No, I have not. He asked if I'd ever invaded someone's privacy or performed what could be construed as a malicious act. I don't think I have. At least I've never performed anything that could be construed as a hack.
Just get a mess with your sampling, pass on it. Most of the research I've worked with is quantitative and works on existing data sets. One of the bigger issues we deal with is sorting the viable population for a study. You hinted at this question at the very first, and I want to know what you're working with. What is your working definition of a hacker?
At the moment, with the quantitative study, there is no definition. The question is simply, do you consider yourself to be a hacker, yes or no? If so, how do you define it? So it's a way to assess an overall baseline measure of what is a hacker. If you check no, then that's fine. If 100 people do it and 5 people say they're a hacker, then the merits of the study are clear and present. The working definition with the qualitative study is a bit more broad. Do you have a long-standing interest in computers and technology? Have you engaged in a variety of different behaviors? Have you ever accessed a system with or without authorization from the owner, engaging in what could be construed as pen testing or otherwise unauthorized access? Have you ever engaged in war driving, phone phreaking, and then more generally, in the course of some research I'm doing, I've been looking at web forums. So hacker-based forums, it's sort of accepted that people who are here are at least interested in hacking. So those are the general working definitions.
Thank you.
It seems that trying to establish moral clarity with regard to the activities of hackers is a little misguided or maybe not implementable in the legal environment that hacking is taking place in, because it's predicated on the assumption that there is a moral right and wrong that went into the design and implementation of the environments in which they're hacking. And that doesn't seem to be the case at all to me. And also, Kevin Mitnick talks about gray hats and white hats, and so there's like It's my opinion that if someone's going to design a piece of software, release it to the public, and sell it to you, then that piece of software shouldn't allocate the resources you paid for in your computer to virus writers or shouldn't sell insecure software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's some of the questions that are actually asked in that quantitative survey. What questions about fair use, what constitutes good software. If somebody makes a bad piece of software, then whatever results is the owner's fault, those kinds of questions. You're right, it is extremely hard to determine any kind of moral ground one way or the other. It's very, very complex when we talk about white hat, black hat, gray hat, all those things. In a lot of research in the social science, from the criminal justice point of view especially, we have a lot of problems like defining gangs. What is a gang in one place may not be a gang in another. And researchers even go back and forth about what constitutes a good definition. How do you identify someone as a gang member? Well, we use the baseline of, do you consider yourself to be a gang member? Are you involved in a gang? So I'm trying to apply some of those same principles, at least in this research, because a person may engage in behaviors that could be considered as a hack but not call themselves a hacker. So just trying to understand a little bit about that dynamic is the point of some of this as well. Are there any other questions?
Yes, two questions. First, are you limiting the scope of your studies just to hacking within the computer security space, or are you also looking at hacking within some of the open source development R&D spaces, and that the term is used in both? Second question is, when asking questions about past illegal activities and things like that, do you ask questions about the time frame in which those were done? Because knowing this community well, having practically grown up in it, most of the people who are older will say no for almost all legal activities. But if you ask them 15 years ago, you're going to get yeses down the line. And I think that the difference between if you still get yeses versus not getting yeses over the course of 15 years or 10 years or 5 years is going to tell you a lot about that person. In particular, because there were a lot of illegal activities that were not serious at all when they were originally occurring, like a lot of the phone hacks, for instance. A lot of the stuff that was being done messing with the phone companies at the time was not serious. Now it would be very, very serious to turn around and do the equivalent things. So does your study address that and the scope of the hacker question?
To answer the second question first, the qualitative study, yes, does ask specific questions about, so when was the first time you ever completed what you define as a hack? And then they'll tell me a little bit about the situation. I'll ask, how old were you? What year was it? To get some baseline about what period of time we're referring to. And yeah, it points to some real differences between older hackers and younger hackers, the beliefs about what constitutes a hack today being much different from what it was then, and now it's so much easier for people to complete malicious behavior, and that's not really what hacking was about back in the 80s or in the early 90s. So yeah, that's part of it. The quantitative study is not able to assess that. It's just asking basic questions about the past 6 months to 12 months. It's a very short frame area. And if you have someone who's a little older who would mark yes or mark no, then that's just part of the data itself. As far as the first question goes, it's open to anyone, whether you are into Linux, whether you are a computer security person, whether you just have a tertiary interest in hacking but you don't work in computer security. However, you have your own network at home, you constantly are playing around, you've made adjustments, you've engaged in what could be considered as a hack. So I try to be as inclusive as possible in all venues. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Again, if you're interested, please come up.